Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining us today for our webinar on cross-border payments. Of course, special thanks to LexisNexis Risk Solutions for sponsoring this webinar and the speakers for taking the time to be with us today. Now, the developments in Southeast Asia's cross-border payment space is one of the most exciting areas that we're keeping an eye on here at Fintech News Network. We're seeing unicorns, both global and regional, trying to disrupt the space, and also incumbents modernizing to keep the competition at bay. And of course, the government to government initiatives paving the way for cross-border efficiencies. And with developments like Project Nexus, I think Southeast Asia has a real opportunity to show global leadership in this space. It's very easy to see why there's so much excitement in this area. To join us today to discuss these developments and more, we have Yip Kakit, the advisor for Bank for International Settlements, right above that. And below Kakit, we have Samarth Bansal, the general manager for Wise. Below Samarth, we have Cher, who is the head of SME and growth for Airwallex. And last but not least, below Cher, we have at Metzger, the Vice President for Market Planning, Payments Efficiency at LexisNexis Risk Solutions. Gentlemen, welcome to the show and thank you for joining us. I think let's kick off the show by talking about some broad trends and some of the biggest developments that's happening in this space. And of course, we can start with Project Nexus, which has already entered its third phase. Kakit, why don't you talk to us a little bit more about Project Nexus and some of the big things that's happening in cross-border payments at the moment? You have the floor, Kakit.
Yeah, thanks, Vincent, for having me at the webinar. So Project Nexus is one of our flagship projects where we seek to enhance cross-border payments, leveraging not on new infrastructure, but on existing infrastructure, which are the fast payment system that have been implemented in more than 75 countries globally now. And by and large, fast payment systems have been performing transformative effect in each of these markets, bringing efficient, fast, and affordable payments, mostly in the domestic space. But interlinking fast payment systems have the potential to bring the user experience and also the efficiency that we see in the domestic space to the cross-border arena. And you may have seen some of the bilateral linkages that have been implemented over the years. The first was the Pay Now, Prompt Pay linkage between Singapore and Thailand. And thereafter, there also have been a few linkages that facilitate QR payments, for instance, between Malaysia and Thailand, Malaysia and Singapore, and so on and so forth. So Southeast Asia is indeed the hotspot for the interlinking of fast payment system. But however, linking payment system one by one is going to be quite troublesome because each linkage would involve complex technical integration and most importantly, multi-party legal negotiation. And hence, if you link up more than 3 countries, then that effort becomes quickly unmanageable. So we did a simulation where if you link up 20 fast payment systems, that requires 190 links. And each of these linkages typically takes 2 to 3 years to finalize end-to-end. And the vision of global instant payments experience is not something that can be achieved within our lifetime. And hence, that is the rationale that gave us the inspiration to come up with Project Nexus, but where we are developing a hub and spoke model that would allow the different fast payment systems to interlink with one another, leveraging on a single connection. So that helps to scale up the promise of cross-border payment system to more countries and regions within a shorter space of time. And we have been incubating this project for a few years now. We started with a blueprint in 2021. In 2022, we ran a successful proof of concept involving the Eurozone, Singapore, and Malaysia. And last year, we worked with 5 ASEAN countries who are leaders in fast payment system linkages, namely Indonesia, Malaysia, Philippines, Singapore, and Thailand, to develop the necessary key building blocks that would be needed for Nexus to be implemented in the real world. So technology is often the easy part. In addition to that, we have also developed the governance model for Nexus, a working scheme rulebook that takes into account the needs and also the requirements in different jurisdictions. And last but not least, a viable business model that would enable not just the fast payment system, but also their participating financial institution to see value and leverage on Nexus for their own benefit and also for the benefit of the end users. So towards the end of June 2024, we have released our comprehensive blueprint, and we were also pleased to announce at that time that 5 countries in the Asia region, 4 of them have been with us in phase 3, namely Malaysia, Singapore, Thailand, and the Philippines. And we are also joined by India as the 5th country. And all these countries have basically committed to work with us to implement Nexus in the real world. So our focus right now is to put in place a new organization. We are calling this the Nexus Scheme Organization that will be owning and also managing the Nexus network. And we will work firstly with these 5 countries and also with other interested jurisdictions to scale Nexus such that it is able to facilitate payments, cross-border payments in an instant and seamless manner. And maybe just to wrap up my intervention, in terms of the key trends, I think fast payments linkages is definitely one, where we are reusing existing infrastructure to achieve greater efficiency. In addition to that, I suppose data is also another key trend. And with the advent of privacy-enhancing technology and also artificial intelligence and machine learning tools, having a multilateral network would allow us to harness some of this data to address some of the frictions in cross-border payments. This would include fraud and scams, leveraging on data to predict and stop fraud before it happens, and also to better combat money laundering and terrorism financing. Because, as we all know, criminals work in networks, and as regulators, we cannot work in silo. And having such data sharing practices would definitely help us to tackle the challenges and also bring about a safer and more efficient cross-border payments.
Thank you, Kakit, for that very comprehensive overview. The simulation kind of blew my mind in terms of the amount of years it would take for all these connections to happen. And I think anecdotally, we can also kind of see that even within the same government, interagency cooperation is quite challenging, right? And then you have government to government, and negotiations can take a lot longer. But I mean, to take a step back, I think the world has really evolved so much, because it's not too long ago that when we want to pay a friend for dinner, even locally, it takes 2 or 3 days. And then now we're able to pay each other in real time, instant payments. That's, the speed of progress is just really insane. Moving on, thanks for that, Kakit. Moving on to Samarth and maybe later Cher how as well. I think one of the things that we think about fintech is that its existence is because there are inefficiencies in the market, right? And arguably, companies like Wise, Airwallex, you guys were really game changers in the cross-border payment space because there were some inefficiencies in that space. How would the efficiencies created by Project Nexus impact your business model? Speak to us a little bit about that, and also talk to us a little bit about some of the big trends that you are observing in this space.
Absolutely. Firstly, very exciting to be here. Incredible panel, looking at the topics that we're discussing. Super exciting to be here. I'm going to maybe reverse the order of the questions there, Vincent. So I'll start with the trends and then maybe get a little bit into how we see Project Nexus help solve for these trends. Trends for us are very clearly defined by customer user expectations, right? If enough customers start expecting something, that starts creating a trend. And one of the things that we've noticed, and maybe more specifically in APAC, is just the number of domestic payment rails that are now instant. Going back to the example that you're giving, we don't even think before I pay now someone, I use a phone number and I'm sending money, whether that's in Singapore, whether that's in India. And those are the expectations, very rightly so, that consumers are now putting on cross-border payments. And those same consumers happen to be business owners, happen to be finance managers in different enterprises. And so their expectations are also starting to migrate into those B2B, B2C payments as well. So this trend of domestic, instant, low-cost payments is now spilling over into cross-border, and that's what's spurring a lot of the activity that you're seeing take place from the regulatory standpoint, from partnerships around the world, but also large traditional players in this space waking up to it. And just on that, I think in the last 3 years, so Wise Platform, just for audiences who are not very familiar with Wise Platform, is one of the 3 product lines that Wise offers, right? So Wise Platform focuses more on enterprises, large banks, incumbent banks, as well as corporates. And so one of the things that we've recognized is that over the last 3 or 4 years, a lot of the traditional incumbents have woken up and realized that low value cross-border transfers need to be instant, need to be low cost, and need to be transparent. And so that expectation has spurred a lot of the conversations that we're having, whether that's launching with Mandiri in Indonesia, Shinhan Bank in South Korea, or even some of the larger digital banks in Hong Kong. Where Project Nexus really fits in is, firstly, it's super exciting to see governments coming together, regulatory bodies coming together, and talk about transparency. I think for me, that was what stood out in this very clear path to the UN goal of we need to make cross-border remittances more cost-effective, but also transparent, so consumers, businesses know exactly what they're paying for. Imagine living in a world where you go buy a service or a good and you have to solve a complex math equation to really figure out what is the cost of that service or that good that you're purchasing, right? Like that shouldn't be the default standard that you're helping consumers drive towards. So that was really encouraging to see in the paper that we saw come out on Project Nexus, but also this path to sustainability, which has been core to us at Wise. The bit that I think it really helps to moves the needle on is reducing the infrastructure cost to make cross-border payments instant. So over the last 5-6 years, we've integrated directly into clearing schemes across Australia, Europe, London, Singapore, Fast and Pay Now, Hungary, and we'll continue doing that going forward. Getting access to these instant payment schemes help us really deliver on that customer expectations of instant low-cost transfers. But there's so much more that you have to stitch together. I'll give you a very good example. You have to have your compliance programs real-time working, ensuring that you're taking care of all the screening and risk monitoring that you need to do. You need to have close to real-time liquidity provisioning and FX management. You need to ensure your customer experience is validating all the information that you're getting to create a very successful customer journey. So all of that needs to come together along with the underlying infrastructure to make this instant payment experience. So the point I'm trying to make is getting access to instant payment infrastructure is becoming easier, but stitching all of this together in a payment experience is where it's very difficult.
Thank you for the insight. And I think, one of the trends you brought up, I think it's something that we want to deep dive into a little bit later as well, right? Because B2B payment space is also massive as well. And, it's good to also get a sense of what's happening over there a little bit later. But in the meantime, moving along to Cher, same question. What are some big trends you're seeing? And how is the emergence of things like Project Nexus changing the business model over Airwallex?
Yeah, so again, Vincent, thanks for having us. I'll add on to what Samarth has mentioned and also just give a little bit more context about how we at Airwallex are thinking about all of this. So to give the audience a bit more context, Airwallex is a B2B payments platform covering cross-border payments and cards and payment acceptance. Our mission is to help businesses expand globally, whether from a supply chain point of view or whether it's expanding to new markets. So thinking about it from that perspective and having conversations with business on a day-to-day basis, I think Samarth brought up really good points around the need for low cost, the need for speed, and the need for transparency. And I'll add one more dimension to that, which is there's also an increasing demand for a wider and wider network, right? To have these things to give businesses flexibility to have these 3 constant things across a larger number of markets. And I think some of the recent changes that have happened from a macroeconomic or from a geopolitical point of view really make this more important. So we see a few trends among the needs for businesses when it comes to cross-border payments. I think first, there's a need because of macroeconomic changes and changes in costs, right? There's a need for supply chains to be a bit more flexible, right? And businesses want that flexibility to source goods and products from more markets and to be able to change them as and when they need to. The second thing is the changing geopolitical situation as well means that businesses need to future-proof themselves. And again, that also lends itself to having more flexibility, both in terms of supplier relationships and also ability to raise capital from different markets, right? Which are all cross-border flows. The third trend that we're seeing is that with the rate of globalization, businesses are starting to think a lot more global. And for businesses in Southeast Asia, there are essentially a few options, right? There's an option to expand to developed markets, which is quite challenging, both because of the competition there and the distance from Southeast Asia, or the option of expanding to an adjacent market in Southeast Asia. And I think for Project Nexus, I think the way we're looking at it is that we see integration between Southeast Asian countries and even India as a very good thing, right? I think we see it as expanding the market for Southeast Asian businesses to expand, to build more of a base so that they can move to more countries within Southeast Asia and eventually build that scale to be more successful globally. So we're very optimistic about these types of initiatives and how they can help businesses around Southeast Asia expand and grow.
Thank you for that, Cher Hao. Moving along to Ed, maybe Ed, you can come in from a more global perspective, right? Give us a sense of similar developments you're seeing in other parts of the world. Do you foresee that this kind of instant payment systems for cross-border would be a reality for us for near future?
Vincent, great to be here. Thank you very much. So just before I start, again, to give some context, we at LexisNexis Risk Solutions, we're a data and technology provider, global one. We serve around over 90% of the Fortune 500. So it's a great place to learn about what's happening in the market and where our customers' needs are developing in fraud, identity, financial crime compliance, and payments. As a bit of background, I think I've worked in Brazil, in various parts of Europe, very closely with the US, and you can see very similar trends, I think, to what we're seeing in Southeast Asia. I would say, I think, in Southeast Asia, things are moving along much further and much faster with some of this. But just in terms of the trends that I see, that I pick up from elsewhere, I think everyone's talked so far about the move to instant payments and that momentum. I think there's a couple of other elements to it. So number one is, as the ecosystem becomes faster, slicker, and there's less barriers to customers transacting, what we have always seen in all of those markets I've just mentioned is an explosion in fraud, where fraudsters attack the ecosystem or use it as a means of extracting value from their victims. So I think as we move towards a world where instant payments are connected cross-border, I think as an industry we have to be ready and assume that there's going to be a very significant threat that we'll have to handle. And have to handle that in a world where people's expectations about customer experience are always going up thanks to the smartphone. And so it's that balance of how to combat fraud and have great customer experience. That's going to be, I think, a really a big trend in the future. The second thing I think that we haven't really touched on so far that I think is important is, across the world, what we see is margin compression in international payments. So there's a lot of, as people expect payments to be, people and companies expect payments to be faster, more convenient, and also cheaper. And you can see that very clearly in the statistics. And I think one of the challenges there as an industry is how we focus on making the payment flow more efficient, because that's the way to get actors to move faster, and especially in this world that I think it was a very good point made around how to have the right economic incentives for participants in Nexus to move forward. How do you get the actors to think, right, I can have a sustainable business model when I've moved to instant payments? And so I think that looking at operational efficiencies, making sure that payments don't fail, and that you can very tightly manage your liquidity, especially in the world of rising interest rates, it's going to be very important.
I think you've brought two very interesting points for us to think about, right? And you rightly pointed out that when the payments are instant, so is the fraud as well. I would like to maybe also direct that to Kakit after this, but maybe just a quick follow-up to you, Ed, is that since we are looking at maybe new types of risks and maybe new type of typology for fraud, along with this real-time instant cross-border payments, right? What can be done to mitigate or reduce this kind of risk for the users and the customers?
Well, so I think that's a great question. The one thing I always like to think about, and my experience, I sort of worked 20 years in banking, was sometimes you feel that in the eyes of compliance and fraud specialists, actually that the best international payment is no international payment. But that's not the way the world works. We are here to facilitate international trade and money movements. So I think the challenge here is how to use data and technology to make the payment safe behind the scenes, so that the customer experience is unimpacted. There's always a debate about actually sometimes what we see in some of the domestic instant schemes is actually creating some very visible friction at the start of a payment has actually been associated with the customers being more aware that they're doing something high risk. But generally speaking, using data and technology behind the scenes is the way to go. And what I mean by that is consortiums of sharing data. It's about using all the sources of data available to you to understand the riskiness of a payment, and then also using data to, on the spot while the payment is actually being created, for instance, to check, is the payee that this person's paying to the actual owner of the account? And you can do all of these things without getting right in the way of the customer journey. And I think that's, as the industry develops, that's will be the challenge, which is getting more data sources, more sources of validation, verification, and combining that as well into an API process flow, so the customer, be it a person or a corporate, has a seamless payment flow without significant interruptions.
Thanks for those insights, Ed. Over to Kakit. I think he also spoke a little bit about some initiatives around machine learning, data for the purposes of fraud prevention, right? Can you speak to us a little bit on that aspect?
Certainly, and I suppose as instant payments become a reality for cross-border payments, there's a need to ensure that the element of trust and confidence is also maintained, if not enhanced. And I think in the context of Project Nexus, we try to achieve this using a two-pronged approach. On one hand, we really see the opportunity to foster the alignment with higher standards, leveraging on the multilateral platform that we have put in place, such that we are in the position to set higher expectations in terms of the scheme obligations that our participants will need to adhere to in order to be qualified to process payment on the Nexus network. And we do note that it's always there's always a trade-off, and hence in order to encourage more participants into Nexus and foster end user confidence, we need to get this right, at least at the beginning. To this end, in the scheme rulebook, we do prescribe some monetary fraud controls that the participating financial institution would have to adhere to. And this is intended to address the weakest link risks, such that at least we know with the mandatory fraud controls, we would ensure that the weakest link would have a certain level in terms of fraud mitigation, and that would help to spur confidence and trust in the cross-border transaction. But in addition to that, we do note that we need more advanced tools to fight fraud, not looking purely at ex post measures to recover the funds, but also to see how we can stop fraud before it is happening. And in this regard, so BIS Innovation Hub, we have 7 centers around the world. So in our London center, we are working on a project called Project HERTA that looks at how network analytics and also artificial intelligence and machine learning can be harnessed to better fight fraud. So in the context of fast payment network like Nexus, there would be a lot of data that can be generated through the transactions. And I think the challenge that we are trying to address through this project is to see how we can facilitate the sharing of data in a privacy enhancing manner, and then leveraging on some of these AI tools to see how we can create a model in which we can then use that to provide fraud scoring to the participating financial institution, so that will become one of the tools that they can leverage upon to better identify and stop fraud before it transpires. And this is something that's being experimented not only in Project HERTA or Project Nexus, but also, we do note that many fast payment systems around the world have started to implement the National Fraud Portal or the National Fraud Response Center in the case of Malaysia. And I think the whole idea is to see how we can collaborate to better fight fraud, leveraging on the data that's generated through the payments transaction, but doing so in a privacy enhancing and secure manner.
And I think that's a fantastic point, right? Because fraud doesn't happen in isolation. And at the end of the day, even domestically, there are different jurisdictions. And I think in the past, they do take advantage of the fact that sometimes these jurisdictions don't talk to each other, right? And enabling this kind of data sharing will take a step towards better fraud prevention. After all, these kind of crime syndicates are not domestic in nature either. So it's a good progress and a step in the right direction also. I want to switch gears a little bit and talk about the point that Ed brought up about margin compression. But before we go there, Cher and Samarth, anything to add to the conversation about fraud and whatnot? Otherwise, we will jump on to the other talking point, which Ed brought up earlier. I think margin compression is an interesting thing to think about, right? For organizations like Wise, for organizations like Airwallex, with the margins getting smaller and smaller and investors demanding more and more profitability, demanding more and more financial discipline, how do you guys operate in this environment? I'll open the question to both Samarth and also Cher. Feel free to take it on.
Yeah,
yes,
maybe
Samarth.
I can get the ball rolling. So
Sure.
I think this pressure we have put on ourselves. So if you look at our mission, we've been very clear that we want to continue making cost of cross-border remittances lower. We want to make them faster and we want to make them cheaper. What I loved about the way Ed positioned this was, this is doable, right? Like, this is not difficult, or it requires a lot of investment. It requires a lot of focus, but it is definitely doable. And if I may, like, we're a testament to that, right? We're publicly listed for the last 8 years. We've been profitable, building out a cross-currency money movement business that today moves about $200 billion worth of Sing dollars annually. 62% of these transactions are instant. And the way that we've been able to do this is honestly building a lot of efficiencies into our infrastructure. Some of it you're able to scale away as volumes increase, but a lot of this you have to be very deliberate about. So I'll give you a good example of this, and it touches a little bit on the machine learning aspects and the AI aspects. If you spoke with our treasury teams, we would be able to tell you 10 days out at 3 p.m. what our liquidity demand would be for INR payouts. And we are using multiple factors in estimating what that would look like. So do I need to have $5 million worth of INR liquidity to sufficiently successfully do the payouts for my 2 INR volumes? Do I need to have lower? And the closer we get to that date, the more accurate we become at forecasting that. And then not just that, but automating this to get a notification on when we need to be topping up our liquidity accounts, right? And so efficiency tools like this really help us very quickly get to the bottom of where should we be investing and how do we help drop that one additional basis point of cost to the customer, drop that, improve or reduce our customer contact rates. And this goes back to another thing that was mentioned is a lot of our customer contact rates used to be about where is my money, what's happening to our funds. And so we've solved that by getting closer to clearing schemes, building a lot of intelligence in just giving the customers the visibility on your money has been paid out, it will reach your recipient by so and so date, which is a very interesting statistical model that we've built around that. As well as building in confirmation of payee and validations upfront, so we don't have a lot of bounce backs or unsuccessful transactions when you initiate payments with us. So the only way, this is a trend that is going to continue, right? Like you will expect to see cost of cross-border remittances continue to drop, and you just need your infrastructure to be very, very clearly focused on what are the cost drivers and how do you build efficiencies in reducing those costs. We dropped our prices by 2 basis points last quarter, and it required a lot of investments from our side, right? And we'll continue making those investments because every additional basis points that we're able to drop requires more efficiency building. And so it's definitely tricky.
But whatever you guys are doing, it's certainly working, right? Because you guys saw a 24% year-on-year increase in revenue. You guys are profitable 4 years in a row. So, your formula clearly checks out, right? Joao, anything to add to this?
Yeah, I think we actually see margin compression as a positive thing. I think, first of all, of course, it's beneficial to the
Certainly.
end users of cross-border payments. And with margin compression, we see more opportunity for companies to expand, right? Doing business overseas becomes cheaper and becomes easier. So we also expect to see flows increase. The second point I would say around this is that we have thought about our business with the lens of efficiency from day one, right? So when we think about margin compression and the way the industry is going, there will be some players that are better equipped to deal with low margins as compared to other players. I think when it comes to Southeast Asian payments in particular, there are still a lot of inefficiencies and very high costs that participants face while moving money around Southeast Asia, not just purely from a payments point of view, but also from exchange rate volatility point of view, right? So we do think that with lower margins, it actually does benefit the players who have built more efficiency in nature. I think, and the way we think about this at Airwallex is every time we build something, we build it for scale. And I think with cross-border payments, really when you're thinking about moving money through a network of 180 or 200 countries, right? You're really thinking about scale from day one, because it doesn't work when you're, doing a small number of transactions or moving a small amount of money. So whenever we build out either a new backend feature to deal with risk or compliance or fraud, or a customer experience, we really think about how we can make that relevant for all our markets and improve the user experience at the same time. So everything we release, even though it may be a manual process at the start, it's always built with a goal of automation and efficiency and keeping our costs low moving forward. We do see a lot of opportunity to improve costs for businesses and consumers operating around Southeast Asia. And actually, we are quite optimistic about the state of where things will be in 5 to 10 years from now, or even in the shorter term.
Very cool. Now, I want to switch gears a little bit, and this question would be up your alley, right? But before that, just to remind the audience, feel free to type in your questions into the comment section on whichever channel you're tuning in from, and we're happy to take whatever relevant questions from and then direct it to the fellow panelists. Now, I think earlier part of the webinar, we spoke a little bit about B2B payments, with which Samarth has brought up. And I think we're seeing so much development in the consumer space. We're seeing so much innovations. And I think part of it is because the consumer space is always sexy, right? And the media always reports on it. But, give us a sense of what's happening on the B2B side of things. What kind of innovations is happening? What kind of efficiencies are we seeing? And what kind of evolution can we expect down the road? And, since Airwallex is specializing in B2B, you'd be in the position to also answer that question as well. Go ahead, Charles.
Yeah, thanks for that question, Vincent. So we see a few things happening in the B2B space. I think when we think about cross-border payments, traditionally, it's mainly been bank transfers, and that's what most people think of when they think about cross-border payments. But we do see other types of payment methods gaining hold as well. And depending on the business case or use case, those may actually improve the end customer experience, right? So one of the trends that we've been seeing quite increasing quite rapidly in the past few years is the rise in card payments, especially for B2B use cases, especially for cross-border payments, when collecting across Southeast Asia is quite difficult, expensive, and takes time. We've seen that businesses are more open to accepting card payments from customers and businesses around Southeast Asia. So especially in the B2B space, where corporates are more likely to have access to cards, right? That's a little bit more prevalent. On the B2C side, when corporates are working with consumers, we do see the proliferation of local payment methods and acceptance as businesses expand across Southeast Asia. So I don't want to downplay the importance of other payment rails as well. Those are equally important as we think about the space.
I mean, certainly card payments would work for smaller payments, but when it comes to large payments to vendors, maybe that might not be the best method sometimes as well, right? Thanks for the input also, Chihao.
Actually, you'll be surprised. We've seen an uptick in the rise of large ticket B2B payments, right? And it's at times, although there's some cost, it's worth the certainty and the flexibility that allows for a business to collect payments in a different market. Yeah, I think you'll be surprised at the kind of industries we've seen.
I am surprised.
Payments happening in.
It's always good to learn something new. Thanks for the input. Ed, what are you seeing in the B2B space? Any?
Yeah, so I mean, I think you make a really good point, right? Which is it is very easy to focus just on B2C because it's more intuitive, but actually the vast bulk of international money movements are still B2B, right? So what the trends I think that we see there is obviously there's when you think about those flows, there's some other drivers, right? So typically, the value extracted tends to be bigger, even though the margins are smaller. I mean, I think one of the things that we hear a lot from customers is in this world of ever-growing regulatory scrutiny in terms of financial crime and some of the recent geopolitical events, there's a lot of complexity when you're doing financial crime screening, which is obviously an obligation. Typically in most domestic schemes, you don't have to look at that, right? There's an understanding that it's a walled garden and there's trust in that ecosystem. But as soon as you go cross-border, there's an extra burden, and it's a growing burden. And obviously there's one challenge in the retail space. It's about the volume of transactions, and every time you stop a payment, that's a bad customer experience, but it's also cost for you, right? And it's just a numbers game about how to get the right systems and tools and data to be able to reduce that hit rate. I think on the corporate side, the challenge is more when you're doing international money movements, trade finance, etc. Nowadays, there's a heightened expectation of understanding, for instance, who's the ultimate beneficial owner of the entities along the chain. So I think when we look at that, the expectation is, I'm going to there's going to be a margin compression here, but actually there's a countervailing force, which is how do I comply with the expectations of regulators and governments. And I think again that's that's a challenge where data and technology can really help. But I think that one's the big topic for business to business payments. The other thing I think just to think about there is where we have international money movements, and we're doing, there's obviously certain corridors where there's huge liquidity, huge flows, and one of I think the challenges is how does that work as the world economy expands and gets more integrated? How do you get into some of the more complex corridors? And I think that some great work being done by some of the panelists here, and at Airwallex, etc., of how to help customers, how to help corporate customers do that. But I do think that financial crime compliance thing is a big challenge, because it's no longer just enough to say I'm going to screen the company name. It's who owns that company, who owns the owners, and that complexity really adds the costs and time to that as well.
Certainly, what you're saying is music to Kakit's ears, right? I mean, being a former regulator, I think you're really singing his tune over there also. Thanks for the views. And also moving on to Kakit, on the B2B side of things, right? Are there projects or other things that the BIS is working on to drive efficiency in this space?
Yes, and I think maybe I can start with Project Nexus. The way that we have developed Nexus is such that it is scalable to cater to higher transaction volume, whether it's B2C or even B2B, that can be facilitated. But of course, the necessary controls would have to be put in place to mitigate any potential fraud. So on the B2B space, I suppose, I think I echo what the panelists have said just now in terms of challenges regarding regulatory compliance. And this is compounded by the different requirements that may be imposed by different regulators. And the other, of course, would be the FX costs, the costs associated with having to pre-fund the transaction, and also to get liquidity in time to settle so that the transactions are not held up. So we do have embarked on a few projects to tackle some of these frictions. Let me start on the compliance space. We have Project Mandala that is being led by the Singapore Center, the BIS Innovation Hub in Singapore. And what we try to do is that leverage on smart contracts and some of the emerging technologies to see how compliance processes can be automated such that we can reduce the costs associated with manual processes. And I think, for instance, in the case of emerging economies, there are capital flow management rules which rely on certain approvals to be validated, and also certain threshold that needs to be assessed against before the payment is allowed to be credited to the beneficiary. And typically, these are done by compliance officers that work, not on a 24/7 basis. So what we try to do in Project Mandala is to encode some of these regulatory requirements, and we start with requirements that are quantitative in nature, such that if this can be automated through the use of smart contracts, then potentially the straight-through processing, can be realized when it comes to these P2B payments. Another project that I would like to highlight would be Project Rialto that the Singapore Center recently launched, as well as Project Mariana, that we have collaborated with our Eurosystem Center and also our Swiss Center, basically to look at how we can drive greater efficiency in the FX transactions, leveraging on DLT, CBDC, and tokenized transaction. So to reduce pre-funding costs, the potential of using CBDC to facilitate atomic settlement could help to drive greater efficiency in cross-border payments. And likewise, I think some of the AI tools can also be used to better predict the liquidity needs, such that the amount of pre-funding can be reduced. And I think when it comes to dealing with illiquid currencies, I think we will also try to see how local currency settlement can be facilitated through some of these newer mechanisms, such that when we deal with higher transaction volume in B2B payments, such efficiency gains can help to reduce the cost to the corporate customers.
It's always fascinating to hear what the BIS is doing. You guys are really doing a lot of groundbreaking stuff over here. But do you have like a committee name with all these names or something? It's always so many interesting project names here.
Yeah.
How does the naming even come about, anyways?
Yeah, so that's definitely the secret sauce of the BIS Innovation Hub. Yeah, and I suppose I think different centers have different ways of coming up with a name that hopefully catch the imagination of our partners as well as the public at large.
It's always creative. Thanks for that, Kakit. Samarth, over to you. And I know there's been a shift also to focus on B2B payments in Wise as well. Talk to us a little bit about the space, the kind of solutions you're also rolling out, and how do you see B2B cross-border payments evolving in the near to medium term also?
Absolutely. So firstly, I think a lot of the insights that the panelists shared, I agree with a lot of them. What we're seeing is very interesting is, so maybe just taking a step back on where we got to where we are today, right? The reason why a lot of what started off as consumer payments being broken, and now we're saying what's broken in the B2B space. And then I'm sure we'll eventually get to some of the larger ticket sizes on the enterprise space as well. It's predominantly because if you think of the evolution of the bank, it started off with a very domestic focus, right? Like when banks started off, the license was, hey, you're lending or providing banking services to customers in Singapore, and here's the license, and this is what you need to try and solve for. But then gradually, as trade and people movement started, banks started realizing we need to connect these different silos that we have now built across multiple markets. And the way that they built this out was through SWIFT, but the technology stacks were still very separate. The licensing regimes were still very separate. And that's what's created, that infrastructure has what has resulted in inefficiencies, right? Now, the reason why B2C started is because a lot of consumers lead the expectation setting on what they would expect from cross-border payments. But we're now starting to see that flow over into B2B as well. Broadly, there are two things that we look at. One is, very simply put, the accounts payable journey. So these are businesses wanting to pay invoices around the world, and where they tend to be hamstrung a little bit through the traditional infrastructure is the cost of the payment, but also the certainty of the payment, right? So if on a SWIFT transaction, you initiate a wire, 2, 3, 4, 5 days, and that's the happy path, right? Like if there's something that breaks down, you spend a lot more time in trying to figure out where the money is, how do I repair this transaction and then get it to my beneficiary. A lot of these tend to be critical payments. So when we work with Aspire as a good example, or GMO in Japan, these are banks or neobanks that are serving SMEs, right? And so they integrated with our infrastructure for those three reasons. You're able to help bring the cost of the transaction down. You're helping pay in a consistent manner at speeds that SMEs get amazed by. Now, the advantage of that speed is you can afford to pay your supplier as close to the invoice date as possible. And so you're conserving your working capital. You don't have to overextend your working capital. You don't have to factor in for 5 days worth of time that it'll take for the invoice to be paid, right? So that's one trend that we're definitely seeing, that how do we move from predominantly what used to be US dollar wire payments for invoices to more businesses being comfortable doing invoice payments in GBP, in euros, in Aussie dollars to these local suppliers that they have in around the world. On the accounts receivable side, I think, again, they've realized that if they just give one bank account and said, hey, wire me the money, they don't know whether they'll be fully credited that amount, how much money will the bank, the correspondent charge them, and when they'll receive the money. So we're starting to see this push from businesses and SMEs as well as Wise platform partners to ask for local account details. help me get the ability to collect an Aussie dollar invoice in Aussie dollars, help me the ability to get euro invoices paid in euros, and then bring that money back into my home currency at the speeds, low cost FX that we're all accustomed to from Wise, right? So broadly, those are the trends that we are seeing on the accounts payable side. More businesses wanting certainty and speed of payments and delivery amounts. And on the recipient side, how do I break a cross-border transaction into local account details and then collect locally from my customers?
Thanks for that, Samarth. Before I move on to a loaded question which I had in mind, let's take one question from the audience first, and then we can do that, and then we can move on to final thoughts. I think maybe this might be best directed at Kakit. What is the role of Swift with the development of Project Nexus right now?
Yeah, so maybe I start by saying that there's unlikely to be a payment system or arrangement that will rule it all. There's likely to be a multiplicity of a payment system and arrangement. And that is, the landscape now, and it's likely to be the landscape of the future as well. And there are benefits of having a multiplicity of payment arrangement because it promotes choice for the end users, and it also enhances resilience. So when it comes to the impact of Nexus vis-a-vis Swift, I suppose there are potential synergies that can be harnessed between both ecosystem. For instance, I think there are some tools that have been developed within the Swift ecosystem that potentially Nexus can leverage on to provide greater value to both the industry and also the end users. And likewise, with respect to the Swift and also the Nexus ecosystem, interoperability could also be some area that we can explore together, such that transaction that started with Nexus can be completed with Swift and vice versa. And so I think there are many opportunities that we can explore together. And I suppose we are in a sweet spot in that there are many years of learnings and innovation that has been developed by the financial industry at large through the Swift ecosystem and beyond. And those learnings can also be harnessed by us on the Nexus front to see how we can better enhance, bring greater efficiency and safety to the cross-border space.
I'm sure they're glad to hear that, because I know some of the Swift folks are actually tuning in today. Anyways, moving on to the next. Thanks for that, Kakit. Moving on to the next question, right? And I think we spoke a little bit about CBDCs, DLT. I want to kind of maybe think about how the role of these emerging technologies will shape cross-border payments. And the other question I have is that, when things like crypto and Bitcoin first came into our minds, one of the key things that they were supposed to solve is cross-border payments, right? And I think there was a time where a lot of these efficiencies weren't in the market yet. So 2 questions, and I open it to any of the panelists who would like to take it on. Number 1 is, what's the role of DLT and CBDCs? And number 2, in the current situation in the market for cross-border payments, is there even any need for cryptocurrencies as a medium for cross-border payments? And again, I open to any panelists who would like to take this question.
I'll just chime in with.
Sure.
I can go first. I'll just chime in with some of what we've seen in the market, right?
Okay.
I think with regards to, when we talk about payments, network effects are always in play. I think you don't just have to think about whether you want to make a payment in a particular method or rail, but you have to think about acceptance as well. I think when specifically when it comes to B2B payments, I think we haven't actually seen that much demand for crypto payments and acceptance, partly because I think B2B payments are much more nuanced, and there are a lot of other needs that businesses have that ride on top of the payment itself. So, for instance, I think what has been quite mature in the bank transfer card payment space are things like reconciliation. And when you introduce a new payment method, I think there or means of payment, there are more complexities that come with that. Having said that, I think in the C2B side, we do see a little bit of we do see some demand, but it varies quite a lot by geography and industry for acceptance of crypto as a payment method. And I think that's because on the consumer side there is a lot more interest and proliferation.
Thanks, Jehan. Kakit, it seemed like you wanted to jump in as well.
Yes. So I think what I was about to share is that I think the nature of financial transaction is evolving, and more assets are being tokenized, and some of the innovation that we have seen, in the DeFi space are also being, implemented or inspired newer solutions in the mainstream finance, and hence I suppose the need for a safe settlement asset to cater for the tokenized economy is important. While it may be possible to integrate any tokenized system with the RTGS or with the fast payment system, greater efficiency can be realized if we have a tokenized settlement asset that can facilitate a PVP or DVP transactions. And hence, I suppose from the perspective of the central banks and also the BIS, the singleness of money is important, where there's confidence in the value and also in the credibility of the issuer, and hence having instruments like CBDC would help to facilitate some of these use cases to be done in a safe and secure manner. To what extent crypto has a role to play, I think that is something that has to be seen from the perspective of AML, regulation, and also other regulatory perspective. So the framework may differ between one country to another, and there's a need to ensure that there's no arbitrage across countries, and key public policy objectives like AML, CFT mitigation, fraud mitigation, are mitigated. Yeah.
Thank you, Kakit. I have to say this has been one of the more challenging topics to moderate because there's just so much to talk about, and like before I know it's almost an hour. I guess let's move on to closing thoughts, and I invite maybe add Samarth, Cher, and then back to Kakit to share with us your final thoughts and maybe talk about some of the important points or important developments that maybe we've missed out in our conversation, starting with Ed. Feel free to also maybe look at some of the questions if you feel it fits into your final thoughts also. Ed, you have the floor. Go ahead.
Yeah, so I think it's been a great conversation. So thanks for having us. And it was a really exciting topic. I've been out in Southeast Asia a couple of times over the last 6 months. Very exciting area, and I think there is, it's the title of the webinar is absolutely correct, right? So it's going to be a revolution, and I think the advent of Nexus and the active participation of Southeast Asia, that's going to be a really interesting element. I mean, for me, the key is around how, as institutions in the ecosystem, companies can balance effective risk management and cost efficiency with fantastic customer experiences, because I think that's it's all we can sometimes become quite inward looking, but actually no one gets up in the morning and thinks, great, I'm excited today because I'm going to make an international payments. It's always a means to an end, and I think that ability to give great customer experiences, making sure the payment, it's easy to create, it's easy to send, it's going to get there on time, and we minimize the number of failed payments, the number of times we have to stop a payment for sanctions while maintaining our regulatory obligations. I think that's the really critical challenge that Southeast Asia is going to be facing as the business evolves and as Nexus rolls out.
I think the only folks that wake up excited about this are the 5 of us and the folks who are tuning into this webinar. Thanks for that, Ed. Moving on to Samarth. Any closing thoughts, any important points you'd like to cover before we wrap up the session?
I think I agree. And this is a trend that we're not just seeing in Southeast Asia, right? Like this movement to instant and movement to cross-border and instant is global. And probably Southeast Asia is helping define what this would look like, whether that's the regulatory bodies, the government bodies coming together and solving for this. But this is something that you can't put the genie back in the bottle. There's no, this is not going in the other direction. This is only going to go in one direction. And truly thinking through what it takes to build this infrastructure and operate it efficiently is extremely important. And the reason why I say that is that helps define the choices you make as participants on Project Nexus, as partnerships and collaborations that you do, helps shape the conversations with SWIFT and other correspondent banks that you would be working with. So it's extremely important to really dig down and realize what is that value customers are expecting and how do you build these efficiencies into your own infrastructure, either from the ground up or by partnering.
Certainly. Thanks for that, Samarth. And Cher, how?
Yeah, thanks for having us as part of this discussion again. I think for me and for us at Airwallex, I think we're incredibly optimistic about the state moving forward for cross-border payments, right? And especially when we think about B2B payments, I think I resonate with Ed, right? No one is really excited about having to make a cross-border payment, or I'll just extend that to make any payment at all, right? It's usually in service of a bigger need.
We're more excited to receive payments most of the time. Sorry,
yes,
carry on.
Very true. I think where B2B is concerned, I think it's important to understand that I think business needs are typically much more nuanced than those of consumers. And it's not just the payment itself that is important. And some businesses value speed. Some businesses would value certainty, and some different businesses value different things, right? But there's a whole ecosystem built on top of the payment stack as well, around reconciliation, around accepting different payment methods that are important to businesses as well. So I think as participants in the ecosystem, both public and private, everybody has a role to play in building out the different components of this ecosystem. And I think there's a lot of innovation going on, and I personally am very optimistic about the state of where we'll get to in the next few years.
Excellent. And Kakit, your final say?
Yeah, I think maybe I will end by saying that the instant cross-border payments is increasingly become the expectation, if not the reality, in today's world. And so we talk a lot about margin compression and so on. I think the goal for the industry and also for the regulators is to see how we can create a larger cake for everyone. Cross-border payments doesn't have to be a zero-sum game where when somebody wins, another person loses. If we create a larger cake and foster opportunities for more value-added services to be introduced to further enhance end users, I think that would basically represent a great leap in the history of financial industry. And I suppose that is something that I would want to leave in the minds of everyone. Thank you so much.
That's a positive note to end on. And with that, folks, thank you all for tuning in. And of course, thanks to all the speakers for taking the time today. See you and take care.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Vincent.